Hello, and welcome to Jason's Education Lounge podcast, brought to you by Think Academy. At Think Academy, we make learning across K-12 a fun, creative, and engaging experience. Every episode is a conversation with experts in education and education technology. We talk about learning beyond test scores and provide both educators and parents with solutions that work for their children. I'm your host, Jason. It was a bigger change for me going from secondary to university than when I went from China to the UK. And I feel that very much so because I feel there's a huge culture difference when you go from a boarding school bubble into the university. And of course, being a university lecturer, you face and deal with students from all backgrounds, which leads on to another part of it is in the company that I'm working for, we're noticing that pupils from the state sector are usually about a year and a half, even 2 years behind those who are in the private sector in a progress in maths. Do you notice sort of the similar change, and what do you think can be done to sort of equalize the two?
I don't know. I wouldn't say I've necessarily noticed that. I think one thing is, once people go to university, we don't necessarily actually know what their background was, and I prefer not to ask. I mean, occasionally there are obvious clues or it comes up in a pastoral discussion, but, there are students who are from abroad, there are students from a disadvantaged background in the UK, and there are students from a very privileged background who've had a fantastic world-leading education. But, I think maybe actually looking at the performance on a maths degree is not the right place to make that comparison. In a sense, I may be the literal worst person to do that because, every university makes offers based on A-level. People get in if they make that offer. And if they're 2 years behind, they may well not make that offer. And so I won't ever meet them in my job. I do think with attainment gaps, one thing to say is closing them is hard. And the evidence that it's hard is that people have been trying to close them for a while. It can become a political football. And the problem when things are political footballs is that there is an emphasis on getting quick solutions within the lifetime of a parliament or, the PISA tests are, I believe, every 3 years. 3 years isn't enough time to solve some of these factors. As we've touched on earlier, I don't think being a maths teacher in the UK is as prestigious now as it was some number of years ago. Clearly, it's not as prestigious as being a school maths teacher in Vietnam, which I had the impression was viewed as a sort of ultra-elite occupation. I'm aware that, working as a tutor for some of these ultra-competitive, ultra-important exams in Korea or in India, like the JEE in India, people earn sort of corporate lawyer-like fees for private tutoring for those per hour. Like the UK don't live in that world. There are a lot of conjoined factors and one can't solve them all in 3 years. And whether we can solve them all at all before the questions just change completely. If one had a plan to fix these things over the course of 60 years, would the question even still make sense 60 years from now? Will we definitely be living and teaching and being educated in the same plane as we are now? I think that's less obvious. I imagine increasing teacher pay would help, but they're not the only industry saying that.
Yeah. As you know, Rishi Sunak has launched his pledge of maths at 18 policy. And now there's a huge call, actually, maybe because of his background, maybe because of what the governments have been trying to do in the past has failed. But what do you think he can do besides this pledge? Or what do you think teachers can do to make maths more accessible, more interesting, more engaging, so that more people actually take it up later on in life rather than just 1 in 5?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. I think it's sort of 22, 23%, something like that. I personally don't think that's that bad. I think our maths A-level is a good exam. It has lots of stuff in it. I wouldn't want it to be watered down to make it accessible for a much wider tranche of society. I think it's hard to know what one should teach people, and probably what one should teach people is a bit different to what we actually do teach people, but it is hard to come up with what it should be. Some things that are useful are hard to teach and hard to examine. Our education system does ultimately, every stage leads to exams. So quite sort of open-ended statistical project work. It's quite labour-intensive and sometimes impossible to examine. But I think one could have visions of a sort of sixth form maths curriculum that had more data analysis, but also some sort of softer data analysis. Often there are statistics in the newspapers that one doesn't need to actually perform any calculations to understand are ill-posed. And these sorts of analytic skills, it would be nice if it was possible to introduce them. The question is, if it were branded not under the name mathematics, would that make it better? Like, maths anxiety, I think, is particularly profound when it's branded as mathematics. Like, when it creeps up on people, like these percentages in my friend's tax exam, it's slightly easier, right?
Yeah.
Also, like, the timings of Maths to 18 don't seem very friendly at the moment. I mean, this is the final year-ish of this parliament. I'm a little bit skeptical. But I mean, there have been other things that have been good. So there is a National Academy for Mathematics is being established. And the UK is one of the leading places for research into AI. There was the AI Safety Summit. I think it was in November, things like that. There are ways in which the UK is sort of pulling its weight, and that has been supported by the current government. But I mean, for me, Maths to 18, if there's no one to teach them, if we're not sure what we're going to teach them, this seems like there's a lot of gaps left to fill in the jigsaw of this plan.
No, yeah, I agree. And I was going to mention that because there is a shortage of teachers, as you know, parents at home are probably having to take up a heavier workload to support their child in any way possible. What can parents do at home? If someone's listening to this podcast right now and they're thinking, oh, my son is studying for 11 plus or GCSEs, but they're really struggling, but I can't afford extracurricular. What can they do at home to help? And what can they do to help with the child's interest in maths?
Right. So, I mean, I guess in some sense, those are separate problems. If you're struggling to prepare for GCSEs and your GCSEs are imminent, then it may be the case that your interest in the subject more broadly is a secondary concern. The way maths exams work are different to other subjects in that they do break down quite clearly by topic. It's less the case that you don't have to write extended essays. If you're really on top of 65% of the course, that means you have a reasonable chance of getting 50 or 45% on the exam. So if you're sort of worried about failing, like when undergraduates come and talk to me to say they're worried about failing their first year exams, let's say. Firstly, normally the ones who come and talk to me about being worried about failing are not the ones who are at risk of failing, but people are often just aiming too high and are sort of struggling to adjust their parameters. They say their goal is just to pass, but they're behaving as if they want to get 100. And as the adult in the room, even though they're adults too, you can help them work through a sort of practical plan for focusing on what they're best at and making the most of that. I will be honest, I have relatively limited experience of people who are struggling to prepare for GCSEs. I've only really worked with students who are struggling to prepare for their university exams, at which point they have the opposite problem in that maybe not that many people are paying attention to them. You know, they don't have parents getting particularly involved. But in terms of maintaining interest, I think there are lots of sources of maths problems out there. And problems don't have to be particularly difficult. It just means a way of doing a piece of mathematics where you don't know immediately in advance roughly how to do it. In an exam, what you want to do is turn over the cover page, read question 1, and if you've worked somewhat diligently and are on top of the material, you want to know roughly how to do question 1. If you don't know roughly how to do question 1, that's sort of the examiner's fault, not yours. Whereas with problem solving, if you turn over the page and you know immediately how to do problem 1, that's probably not a good thing. And that's also the examiner's fault, or you're sort of unusually mature or insightful for your age and experience. Yeah, I think the temptation can be people who are already outstanding sometimes don't need to practice anymore. I think it's not very interesting to, if you're pretty happy solving equations like 3x plus 4 equals 16, doing 100 more examples of that isn't going to help. Everyone does reach a point where you just can do that sort of thing essentially without ever making mistakes. If that's what you're doing in school and you're bored of it, your parents can help, even if it's just by asking the teacher for advice on what are some extension problems related to these tasks to do at least occasionally. And you know, so as I say, I'm a volunteer for the UK Maths Trust. One option is to look up books and past competition papers published by that charity, which does have a quite rich collection for all ages. Well, all ages down to year 7 and 8, and there's a bit below that as well. Just You don't want people thinking that sort of the goal is to get 100% on everything. If you're getting 100% on everything, you're not doing problems that are difficult enough.
Right. I think that helps a lot of pupils when they're struggling. And if we can take our focus away from maths a little bit and move on to a more macro scale, education as we know it has been the same form, the same format, teacher lecturing in the classroom for generations, for centuries. And another one of those industries where it has stayed the same is probably high street retail. And we know that that's dying quite quickly in some of the smaller cities. Do you think that education is something that is just bound to stay in the same format and being taught in the same way forever? And what do you think will be the change in the future in education? Something revolutionary? What's the next big thing?
I find it hard to know what the next big thing is going to be. I think one thing is there's going to be a transitional phase probably where currently education, including A-levels and university, does serve a credentialing purpose as well as an educational purpose. Completing a degree from a top university, let's say in maths, but it could be in anything, shows that you got in. That meant you were good on paper and then worked hard to make your offer. It shows you worked at least somewhat hard. You worked hard enough while you were there, and you must have understood some things. If you have a master's, you must have written a dissertation of some kind. There's been a bit of grade inflation. One have to have a lot of grade inflation before those credential values became valueless. So I think there will always be an intermediate period where, regardless of what developments occur, the credential aspects of not everyone can change the world, right? We all know that. We can't all have hugely impactful roles. And if you are at the point when you recognize that you are probably not going to change the world, your 2-1 or whatever degree from a good university in a recognized subject is a good thing to have, right? Even if it's not involving you changing the world. But with that in mind, I think some traditions are going to stay for longer than people think. Like in particular at university, I think the culture of a lecture where a lecturer turns up and presents, in mathematics normally it has the form that they present theory on the board, they write it, roughly speaking at normal writing pace, and students copy it down. This looks very outdated. School lessons are not really like that. However, when you try and make innovations to that, often students like the innovations even less. On the one hand, it's not very engaging, the traditional form, but maybe the solution is just to make it a little bit more engaging. I think I lecture first year undergraduates. We ask them lots of questions during the lectures. Sometimes there are 300, 400 in the room. There's not much scope for live discussion with that larger group, but you can give people problems to work on with their neighbor, give them exercises. And I think there's a bit more of that now than there was when I was an undergraduate. But I think the jury's out. I know there are students who would prefer to turn up and just be presented the course by someone who knows what they're talking about, and they make notes and reflect on it later. They get video recordings. So given that even these sort of relatively mild innovations are not universally popular and can often be sort of very workload intensive, the traditional format of a lecture, one advantage of it is that you need to prepare notes, you need to prepare what you're going to say, but then when you do things that are more complicated, you have to plan quite a bit more carefully and figure out the timings. Like, how long are you going to give people for each exercise? What if that makes people a bit noisy afterwards? What if people need a break in the middle of the lecture? Things like that. I mean, people have said things like, with the development of AI, soon you'll have personalized AI tutors that might even be better than, human flesh and blood tutors. But somehow I'm a little bit unconvinced. We already have outstanding textbooks in lots of areas. You can go and watch podcasts, you can watch live recordings of lectures, but people actually don't really want to do that. The fact that it exists doesn't by itself mean that people want to access it. People want things that are personal. And I'm not sure yet people think a personalized AI is what they actually want. I mean, teaching may be one of the things that least likely to be affected by that immediately.
Not just teaching per se. Do you think, for example, the format of teaching, because now there's technology which I saw is essentially like a Zoom call, not a Zoom call, but happens online, and the teacher is teaching via the computer, and the camera can pick up if a child is confused, if a child, from micro expressions on their face, if the child is confused, if they're interested, if they're engaged, if they're drinking, if they're eating, if they open another tab, everything like that. Do you think the place for classroom is still essential, or can everything be done work from home remotely?
I mean, who can say how this will develop? We all saw what happened when we all spent most of 18 months at home. I accept there were some people for whom this was like hugely advantageous medically. Some people liked it a lot, but I think many people, and I'm tempted to say the vast majority of people, did not like it, especially in the context of school. I think it made people realize that what you're getting out of going to school is not just the content of that number of lessons per day. I'm skeptical that, within 10 years we'll move to a society where no one ever leaves their house because every single thing can be replicated with the same level of quality and meaning just from your laptop. Kids want to meet other kids, right? Some adults don't want to meet their work colleagues that often, but I think as a broad statement, people want to meet other people and have meaningful interaction outside, what's set up. I do think when we see this, I'm sure you have it in your role as well. There are some meetings where all the important development, creativity happens during the coffee break. And I think that for education, that's the case as well. I mean, certainly we notice that students who come to campus and chat to other students in the breaks between lectures, they sometimes report that, it felt like they were wasting their time constantly having to spend an hour hanging around. They used 25 minutes of that hour well, but that's still a lot more than zero. And I think there are people sitting at home who use 0 of the hour well. So I think, for the time being, people want things in person. If you want to get in trouble as a university lecturer, moving your lectures online exclusively is the first way. Firstly, that's, broadly speaking, not allowed. But, students do not want, even if they're not personally always going to come, they want things to exist in reality.
And this is a situation, for most students who can have access to physical university or physical school, in terms of accessibility wise, if you are in the wild in Africa, in the mountains in China, places like that, do you feel that there is technology, or what can we do to help accessibility for children living in extreme poverty? What can we do there?
I guess the question is, does it not already exist? The question of people living in extreme poverty, maybe there are bigger problems to solve first than, their access to an outstanding mathematics undergraduate curriculum, for example. So it's sort of hard to frame it correctly, but I'll answer a slightly different question. So MIT have had their massive online courses available for maybe 10 years now. These are quite good, right? The one on AI was sort of one of the first of its kind, and pretty much anyone can easily sign up and do it. For how many people have? I'm sure there are loads of people who are interested in this in principle, and they just haven't done it. And I think that's inevitable. This is why people don't want their regular lectures to be put online, because when they at least exist at a fixed time, it avoids it becoming like Netflix, where it's just, you have a list and you're never going to complete your list. I don't know. I think people who are motivated from very non-traditional backgrounds. So I guess I know more about the IMO, so I'll talk about the IMO. There are plenty of countries that used to have almost no training, or potentially literally no training at all. Let's say in the 90s or the early 2000s. But with the dawn of the internet and internet forums and people putting handouts online, there was a sort of explosion in pupils from countries that had never really taken part seriously, turning up and actually doing slightly well. And the answer was how? It was because they'd been spending all their time on forums and potentially doing that instead of going to school. They were more focused on it than people from Britain could be, because our pupils had more constraints. They couldn't spend all their time engaged in this online world connected to Olympiad problems. And I think the only thing one can say is it's a good thing. I don't think every single document that exists should be public domain, but enough is that it gives a huge opportunity for people to access things that it's just completely impractical for them to access generally. There are countries that are really large and so can't have in-person meetups that often, or just don't have a national maths infrastructure. And so I think we've already seen some examples of that. I guess the question then is to say, well, what about people who are leading genuinely disadvantaged lives? Are they making the most of their mathematical potential? And the answer may be no, but I also, there would be initial steps. Maybe that's a second order feature rather than a first order feature.
Sure. Just to pick up on the point that you mentioned earlier about A levels and degrees being for credential purposes to show an employer that you can actually sit through and write a dissertation. Do you think having, for example, a degree or doing A level in maths helps in the eyes of the employer? And why does it help? So if it helps, why do they think that is more attractive to have a math degree, in your opinion?
My impression is, I haven't crunched the stats on this, but just anecdotally, people with maths degrees from strong universities in the UK get employed. Unless they sort of have really unusual other features, or they sort of only want to work for one of 3 ultra elite firms, people can find jobs. Maths graduates are in demand. And so if you are currently a maths student, it's sort of in your interest to not heavily promote maths in this country, because currently you're on the right side of the supply and demand curve, I would say. Maybe employers should be asked rather than me. I think there is a perception that maths is difficult, and there is a perception that may or may not be true, and there's a perception that maths is sort of hierarchical and it builds on things, and that is true. And I think these are sort of more transferable skills at the university level than they are at school level. So I guess in order to do well at a maths degree, you have to be able to reason with abstract ideas, but then present them really coherently. It's not just like solving equations when you're 14. You just sort of start with the equation, write the first step, write the second step, and then you're at the answer. People get marks for clarity of thought. And in tutorials or smaller group teaching, people really get a sense of what it means to present complicated things so that other people can understand. I think that's quite transferable. There are times where maths seems more like law, where the tiny details matter, and presenting it coherently while also maintaining the tiny details. That feels like exactly something you would want in an employee. I can only go on what I observe, which is that, especially in finance or finance adjacent industries, there are no shortage of jobs that are looking to hire people with reasonable maths degrees from strong universities.
I just had a thought in my head that kind of ties what we're talking about now to before. If we looked at countries like China, India, Vietnam, you mentioned, and I know strong countries in math like Korea, the Asian countries, they all sort of have a history of poverty, have a history of, a very tough background. And some of the countries are going through poverty now. Do you think that culturally people have such an emphasis on maths because they think that math is one of the ways to alleviate poverty for a higher income, etc., etc.? That's why in the Western countries like UK, US, Canada, there's not so much valued. Do you think that's a reason?
I think that might be a reason, yes. And I think maybe in the West, there's a focus on the leaders of these companies who maybe have a different set of skills to the typical, if you think of a company that pays its core employees very highly, there will be lots of such companies where many of the employees have a maths, computer science, programming, that sort of background, but the CEOs might have a completely different background. That's sort of normal. I think we sort of all understand that. But then that message might not be so obvious to people who are kids whose families aren't directly involved in that world, that maths and related subjects can be the route to the regular but still excellent and interesting jobs at those institutions.
Nice. I think the last question from me would be for those who are watching, parents or students who wants to pursue a career in maths. What would your advice be to them? What would you say to them, having had such a successful career?
Do you mean a career in maths research?
Yes, exactly. Maths research.
I mean, I think the advice is keep your options open. This is not something you need to have decided when you're 15. There are plenty of people who think they will want to do maths forever, and then they go and do a degree and decide that's enough. And that's not a bad thing. No one's going to be saying things like you sold out or you washed out. If they're saying that, it reflects more on them than it does on you. A maths degree is upwind of a lot of things, a lot of careers, and people with a first study in maths are more likely to go into biology than the other way around. There's huge demand for maths to be applied in other areas of the sciences. So don't fixate too early on the goal of being a professor. It is a complicated funnel. And I think for parents, if your child is interested in that, you don't need to discourage them by saying, it's really hard to get funding for your first postdoc or something. You can get to that when it comes to it. But I think you should be reassured that the good thing about that path is that there are lots of quite safe exit strategies at all points in the funnel. I think it's not like if your child wants to be a concert violinist, like a soloist, the safe exits are playing in an orchestra or being a violin teacher. And playing in an orchestra is pretty hard to get a job for. And being a violin teacher has, some drawbacks. It's not particularly well paid, quite complicated. I don't think maths is like that. Maths has lots of other options that you can exit from. We started this by talking about it being socially acceptable to acknowledge weakness at mathematics. But I think there is also misunderstandings about where it would take you. And people maybe sometimes feel, the only options are to be a professor or a maths teacher. And that's absolutely not true. And the overwhelming majority of graduates in maths from strong universities will probably not be doing either of those options.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, Dr. Yeo. It has been really insightful. And I think our conversation, definitely from yourself, your insights have given a lot of hope to parents and students who probably are having a hard time. And that's exactly what we do here at Jason's Education Lounge. I understand myself that there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to education. And every child is different, unique. And we want to give our listeners a new perspective by talking to guests like Dr. Yeo. Thank you again. And lastly, for the most updated news in the sphere of academia and education, subscribe to Jason's Education Lounge podcast.
That wraps up this episode of Jason's Education Lounge podcast. A shout out to our parent company, Think Academy, a company that provides world-class online and in-person education programs for K-12 students. We're proud to be different, result-driven, and focused on the specific learning needs of your child. Check out our website at www.thinkacademy.uk. And a big shout out to Fame for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening, folks. Stick around for more insights in our next episode. Catch you later.